You ever meet someone by accident and then realize they were the only person you were supposed to find? The music hums low beneath crystal chandeliers, soft laughter drifting like smoke through the air, and Sophie Bennett stands frozen at the edge of a room she clearly doesn't belong in, her black dress simple, slightly wrinkled from a double shift, her shoes worn at the edges, her fingers still faintly smelling like coffee and sugar. She glances at her phone again, rereading the message that brought her here. Private event. Ask for Daniel. Her heart tapping faster against her ribs as she scans the sea of tailored suits and polished smiles. Then she sees him, tall, composed, standing alone near the center table like he owns not just the room, but the silence around it. Alexander Hayes, though she doesn't know his name yet, only that he fits the description too perfectly. Dark suit, sharp jawline, eyes focused like he's already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Sophie takes a breath, steadying herself the way she does before carrying a tray through a crowded diner. Then she walks toward him, weaving past conversations that feel too expensive to interrupt, until she stops at his table and forces a small, polite smile. "Hi, you must be Daniel." Alexander looks up, caught off guard, a flicker of confusion passing through his eyes so quickly most people wouldn't notice. But Sophie does, because she spent her whole life reading people before they speak. He opens his mouth, pauses, glances at his phone, where a message sits unread, canceled, delayed, irrelevant. Then back at her, something shifts, curiosity maybe, or something quieter, something he hasn't felt in a long time. "I was starting to think you weren't coming," she adds quickly, mistaking his silence for hesitation, her fingers brushing nervously against the edge of the table. And instead of correcting her, instead of ending it right there, Alexander leans back slightly, studying her like she's a question he doesn't know the answer to yet. And then, almost against his own instinct, he says, "Traffic was worse than I expected." The lie settles between them. Light but irreversible. Sophie exhales softly, relief washing over her face as she slips into the seat across from him. Unaware she has just stepped into a world that was never meant for her. "I almost turned around," she admits with a nervous laugh. "Places like this, they're not really my thing." Alexander watches her as she speaks, noticing the way she fidgets with the napkin, the way her voice carries honesty without calculation. And it unsettles him in a way power never has, because for the first time in a long time, someone is looking at him without knowing who he is, without wanting anything from him. And he doesn't stop it. Not yet, because something about this mistake feels intentional, like a crack in a life that's been too controlled for too long. And across the table, Sophie smiles again, softer this time, unaware that the man she thinks is a stranger is about to become the one person she won't be able to forget, and neither will he. The waiter arrives with 2 glasses of water and a menu that looks more like a piece of art than something meant to be read, and Sophie hesitates before even touching it, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar words like they might expose her. "I hope you are okay with simple," she says, half smiling. "I am more of a burger and fries kind of person." Alexander watches her closely, something almost unnoticeable softening in his expression as he replies, "Simple sounds good tonight." And for once, he means it, because nothing about this feels like the calculated dinners he usually endures. No business angles, no hidden expectations. Just a girl who is clearly out of place and yet strangely unafraid to be herself. Sophie lets out a quiet breath, relaxing just enough to lean back in her chair. "So, Daniel," she begins, testing the name like she is still convincing herself this is real. "What do you actually do?" Alexander pauses, not because he does not know how to answer, but because for the first time, the truth feels like it would ruin something fragile that has barely begun. "I work in tech," he says finally, the same vague shield he has used before, but tonight it feels different, lighter, like he's choosing a version of himself instead of hiding behind it. Sophie nods, impressed in a simple, genuine way. "That sounds important," she says, then laughs softly, shaking her head. "I cannot even fix my own phone half the time." Her fingers play with the edge of her napkin again, a small habit he's already starting to notice. "I work at a diner," she adds, more casually than she feels. "Morning shifts mostly, sometimes nights if they need me." It is not glamorous, but it keeps the lights on. There is no shame in her voice, just honesty, and that honesty lands harder than any polished introduction he has heard in years. "And what would you do if you did not have to worry about the light staying on?" he asks, surprising even himself with the question. Sophie blinks, caught off guard, her eyes drifting for a second as if she is looking at something far beyond the room. "I would open a small bakery," she says quietly, almost like it is a secret she does not usually share. "Nothing fancy, just a place where people feel warm, like they belong." There, even if they do not have much. Alexander does not answer right away, because something about the way she says it, the way she believes in something so simple, pulls at a part of him he has not listened to in a long time. "That sounds like something people would need," he says instead, his voice lower now, more thoughtful. Sophie smiles at that, a real smile this time, the kind that reaches her eyes without effort. And for a moment, the noise of the room fades into the background, replaced by something quieter, something real. But then a man in a tailored suit approaches the table, leaning slightly toward Alexander with a respectful nod. "Mr. Hayes, they are ready for you upstairs." The words hang in the air for just a fraction too long. Sophie's smile falters, her eyes flicking between the man and Alexander, confusion creeping in before she can stop it, and Alexander feels it immediately. The shift, the crack in the moment he chose to step into. He looks at the man, then back at Sophie. And for the first time since she sat down, he hesitates, caught between the truth and the version of himself he let her believe. "I will be there in a minute," he says firmly, dismissing the interruption. The man nods and steps away, but the damage is already there, subtle, unfinished. Sophie tilts her head slightly, studying him now with a new kind of curiosity. "Mr. Hayes?" she repeats softly, and Alexander realizes that the mistake that brought them together is already starting to unravel. But what unsettles him more is not the risk of being found out. It is the realization that he does not want this moment to end. The air between them shifts, subtle but undeniable, and Sophie leans forward just slightly, her brows knitting together as she studies him more carefully now. "That did not sound like someone talking to a guy who just works in tech," she says, her tone still light, but edged with curiosity. Alexander lets out a quiet breath, his fingers brushing against the rim of his glass as he searches for an answer that will not break whatever this is. "It is complicated," he replies, not entirely untrue. Sophie tilts her head, unconvinced but not pushing. Not yet, because something in his voice tells her there is more beneath the surface, and for reasons she does not fully understand, she does not want to scare it away. "Complicated usually means interesting," she says with a small smile. Try to ease the tension, and for a moment, it works. Alexander's lips curve slightly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough. "Or it means messy," he says quietly, and that word lands heavier than expected because it feels closer to the truth than anything else he has said tonight. Sophie nods slowly, her fingers now tracing invisible lines on the table, as if she is thinking through something deeper than the conversation itself. "Messy, I understand," she admits, her voice softer now. "Life does not really give you clean lines, does it?" Alexander watches her, really watches her this time, noticing the way her eyes hold both resilience and something fragile, something she has learned to protect, and it makes him wonder what kind of life forces someone to grow that way. "What about you?" he asks, his voice more genuine now. "What made you stay in something messy?" Sophie hesitates, just for a second, her gaze dropping to her hands before she answers. "People," she says simply, then lets out a small breath. "You try to believe in them, even when it would be easier not to." There is no bitterness in her tone, just quiet acceptance, and that hits him harder than he expects, because he has spent years doing the exact opposite, building walls so high that no one could ever reach him without an agenda. And yet here she is, sitting across from him, still choosing to believe, even after everything. The noise of the room returns in small waves around them, but it feels distant now, like they are somehow outside of it, caught in a space that exists only between the two of them. "You are different," he says before he can stop himself. Sophie looks up, surprised. "Different from what?" she asks, and Alexander pauses, realizing he cannot answer that without revealing too much, without exposing the world he comes from, the one she clearly does not belong to. "From what I expected," he says instead, and she smiles faintly at that. "Funny," she replies. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." Their eyes meet, and for a moment, there is something unspoken passing between them, something that feels dangerously close to understanding, but before it can settle, Sophie's phone buzzes softly on the table. Breaking the moment, she glances at the screen, her expression shifting as she reads the message. "That is my friend," she says, a hint of embarrassment creeping into her voice. She is asking where I am, apparently my actual blind date has been sitting alone this whole time. The realization lands between them like a quiet echo. And this time, neither of them laughs, because suddenly the mistake feels real again, fragile, temporary. Sophie looks back at him, her smile softer now, almost uncertain. "So, you are not Daniel," she says, not as a question, but as a gentle acknowledgement, and Alexander meets her gaze. Knowing this is the moment where everything could end just as quickly as it began. "No," he admits. Quietly, "I am not." And for a second, neither of them moves, the truth hanging in the space between them. But what neither of them says out loud is the part that matters most, that somehow, despite the lie, despite the confusion, neither of them wants to walk away. The silence lingers just a second too long, delicate but heavy, and Sophie lets out a small breath as she leans back slightly in her chair, her fingers curling loosely around the edge of the table as if grounding herself in the moment. "Okay," she says softly, not angry, not even surprised, just processing, and that calm reaction unsettles Alexander more than anything else could have, because he expected frustration, maybe even a sharp exit, not this quiet acceptance that feels far more real. "Okay," he repeats, almost unsure, and Sophie nods, a faint smile returning, but softer now, more guarded. "People sit at the wrong table all the time, right?" she says, her tone light, but her eyes searching his face for something deeper, something honest. "I guess I just picked the wrong one tonight." The words are simple, but they carry more weight than she lets on, and Alexander feels it, the subtle shift from curiosity to distance, from openness to caution, and for the first time in a long time, it is not like being on the outside of that. Or maybe it was the right one, he says quietly, the words leaving his mouth before he can stop them. Sophie pauses, caught off guard by that, her gaze locking onto his. "You think so?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper now, and he nods slowly because despite everything, despite the lie, despite the world waiting for him upstairs, this moment feels more real than anything he has stepped into in years. "I do," he says, and there is no hesitation this time. No performance, just truth. Sophie studies him for a second longer, as if weighing something she cannot quite define. Then she lets out a small laugh, shaking her head gently. "You are really not what I expected tonight," she admits, and something in her tone softens again, just slightly, enough to reopen the door she had started to close. Alexander leans forward a little, resting his forearms on the table, lowering himself into her world instead of towering above it. "Then stay," he says, simple, direct, no titles, no explanations, just an invitation. Sophie blinks, surprised by how easily he says it. "Stay?" she echoes, glancing briefly toward the exit, then back at him. "What about your upstairs thing?" She gestures lightly, and for a moment, the weight of his other life presses in again, the expectations, the people waiting, the version of himself he is supposed to be, but it feels distant now, almost irrelevant. "They can wait," he replies, and it is not something he would normally say, not something anyone would expect from him, and yet here he is, choosing this instead, choosing her, even if it is only for one night. Sophie hesitates, caught between instinct and something else, something warmer, something more dangerous. "I should probably at least tell my friend I am alive," she says with a small smile, reaching for her phone. And as she types quickly, Alexander watches her, memorizing the way her brow furrows in concentration, the way her lips press together slightly, the small details that feel strangely important, like pieces of a moment he does not want to lose. "Done," she says, setting the phone aside, and when she looks back at him, there's a decision in her eyes now, quiet but clear. "All right," she says, exhaling softly. "One dinner with a stranger who is not who I thought he was." She tilts her head slightly, a hint of playfulness returning. "But I get to ask real questions this time." Alexander almost smiles, something genuine, Something rare, fair, he says, and for the first time since she sat down. The mistake is no longer just an accident. It becomes a choice, one they are both making, even if neither of them fully understands why. And somewhere above them, a room full of people waits for Alexander Hayes. But down here, in a quiet corner of a world he never noticed before, he finds himself exactly where he wants to be. The tension eases just enough for something new to take its place, something quieter, more intentional. And Sophie leans forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand as she studies him with a different kind of focus now. All right, she says, her tone light but purposeful. Real questions? Alexander nods once, almost amused by the shift. I am ready, he replies, and she smiles faintly. But there is curiosity behind it now, not just nerves. First, she begins, if you are not Daniel, then who are you when you're not being interrupted by men in expensive suits? The question lands somewhere between playful and direct, and for a second, Alexander considers giving her the easy answer, the safe one, but something about the way she looks at him makes that feel like a loss. Someone who does not usually get asked that, he admits, and Sophie raises an eyebrow. Not satisfied? That is not an answer, she says, and he exhales. Softly, glancing down at his hands before looking back at her. I build things, he says finally, choosing something that feels true without saying too much. Companies, systems, ideas that turn into something real. Sophie nods slowly, processing that. So you create structure, she says almost to herself, and control. Alexander tilts his head slightly, surprised by how quickly she reads between the lines. Something like that. He agrees, and she smiles again, but this time there is a hint of understanding in it. That must be exhausting, she says, and he almost laughs. Not because it is funny, but because no one has ever described his life that way before. You have no idea, he says quietly, and for a moment, the honesty between them feels effortless, like it does not need to be forced or protected. Sophie taps her fingers lightly against the table, thinking, then leans back again. Okay, my turn, she says, shifting the balance. You already know I work at a diner, but what you do not know is that I hate it sometimes, she admits, her voice softer now, more vulnerable. Not because it is hard, but because it is not where I thought I would be. Alexander listens, fully present now, as if the rest of the world is narrowed down to just this conversation. What did you think you would be? He asks, and Sophie hesitates, her eyes drifting for a second before she answers. Somewhere that felt like mine. She says quietly, a place I built, even if it was small, even if no one else noticed. There's a pause after that, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning, and Alexander feels something shift inside him, something unfamiliar but undeniable. You will get there, he says, and it is not a polite reassurance. It sounds like a statement, like he believes it. Sophie looks at him, searching his face for any sign of empty encouragement, but she does not find it, and that unsettles her in a different way. You sound very sure, she says, and he nods slightly. Because you already know what it looks like, he replies. Most people never figure that out. Sophie does not answer right away, but the way she looks at him changes again, softer, more open, like she is, letting him see something she does not usually share. And for a moment, neither of them speaks, the noise of the restaurant filling the silence in a distant hum, until the waiter returns with their food, placing it carefully between them, breaking the moment just enough to remind them where they are. Sophie glances down at the plate, then back up at him with a small, almost surprised smile. I guess I am really doing this, she says quietly. And Alexander meets her gaze, something steady and certain in his expression now. So am I, he replies, and neither of them says it out loud. But the truth settles between them anyway, that this is no longer just a mistake. It is something they're choosing moment by moment without fully understanding why. The plates sit between them, untouched for a moment, as if both of them are still caught somewhere in the conversation they just had. And Sophie finally lets out a small laugh, picking up her fork but not quite using it yet. You know what is strange, she says, glancing at him with a curious tilt of her head. I feel like I have known you longer than, 40 minutes? Alexander watches her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. That is either a good sign or a very dangerous one, he replies, and she smiles at that. But there is something thoughtful behind it now, something that lingers just beneath the surface, Maybe both, she says softly, and this time she takes a small bite, more out of habit than hunger, the taste barely registering as her attention drifts back to him. So tell me something real, she continues, her voice quieter now. Not about what you do, but what you avoid. The question lands differently, deeper, and Alexander stills for a second, caught off guard in a way he does not show often, because no one asks him that. No one looks past the surface he has spent years perfecting. I avoid expectations, he says slowly, the words forming carefully. People tend to attach them to you before they even know who you are. Sophie nods immediately, like she understands more than he expected. Yeah, she says. They decide your story before you even get to tell it. There is a quiet pause after. That, one that feels heavier than before, but not uncomfortable, just honest. And Alexander finds himself leaning into it instead of away from it. What about you? He asks, his voice steady but softer now. What do you avoid? Sophie exhales lightly, her gaze drifting down to the table as she considers the question. Getting stuck, she admits after a moment. Not in a place, but in a version of myself that I did not choose. She looks back up at him then, her eyes clear, open in a way that feels both brave and fragile. I have seen what that looks like, she adds, and she does not explain further, but she does not need to, because the weight of it is already there, and Alexander feels it, not as something distant, but something that connects to his own quiet fears in a way he does not fully understand yet. You will not get stuck, he says again, but this time there's something more behind it. Something that sounds almost like a promise. Sophie studies him carefully, as if trying to figure out whether he believes that because of who she is, or because of who he is, and for a second, the question hangs there unspoken, until she smiles faintly and looks away, choosing not to push it. Not yet. You are very confident for someone who refuses to say what he actually does, she teases gently, and Alexander lets out a soft breath that almost turns into a laugh. Maybe I am just pretending, he replies, and Sophie shakes her head. No, she says quietly, you are not. The certainty in her voice catches him off guard, and for a moment, neither of them speaks, the room around them fading again into background noise, until a sudden ripple of movement shifts the atmosphere. A group of well-dressed guests begin moving toward the staircase, voices lowering, attention redirecting upward, and Sophie notices it first, her gaze following the subtle shift before returning to him. Is that where you were supposed to be? She asks, not accusing, just observing, and Alexander glances briefly toward the stairs, the world he stepped away from now pulling at him again, more insistently this time. And when he looks back at her, there's a flicker of something unresolved in his expression, like a decision that cannot be delayed much longer. Yes, he admits quietly, and Sophie nods slowly, absorbing that, her fingers tightening slightly around her fork before she sets it down. Then why are you still here? She asks, and the question is simple, but the answer is not, because for the first time in a long time, Alexander does not feel like the place he is expected to be is where he actually belongs. And as he looks at her, really looks at her, the truth becomes impossible to ignore, even if he has not said it out loud yet. Alexander does not answer right away, and the silence that follows feels heavier than anything they have said so far, his gaze steady on Sophie as if the rest of the room has already disappeared. Because I do not want to leave, he says finally, the honesty in his voice quiet but unmistakable, and Sophie blinks, caught off guard by how simple and real it sounds, her fingers resting still against the table as she studies him more carefully now. You do not even know me, she says softly, not dismissing him, just grounding the moment in reality, and Alexander nods slightly. I know enough, he replies, and there's something in the way he says it that makes her pause, something that feels less like certainty and more like recognition, like he has found something he did not realize he was missing. Sophie lets out a small breath, glancing briefly toward the staircase again where the crowd has mostly disappeared now, the pull of his world still visible even from a distance, then back at him. People do not just walk away from things like that, she says, her tone thoughtful, not judgmental, and he follows her gaze for a second before returning to her. Maybe they should, he says quietly, and for the first time, there's a trace of conflict in his expression, something unresolved, something that has been there long before tonight. Sophie notices it immediately, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders hold just a little too still, and it softens something in her, not because she understands his world, but because she recognizes what it feels like to carry something you cannot easily set down. You're not just avoiding expectations, she says gently. You are running from something. The words are not sharp, just observant, and Alexander exhales slowly, looking down for a brief moment before meeting her eyes again. Maybe, he admits, and it is the closest he has come to the truth without saying it outright. Sophie nods, accepting that without pushing further, because she senses the line between honesty and retreat, and she does not want to cross it. Not yet. Then maybe staying here is not about me, she says, her voice soft but steady. Maybe it is about you finally choosing something different. The thought lingers between them, unexpected but impossible to ignore, and Alexander considers it, really considers it, because for the first time, it does not feel like a risk. It feels like a possibility. What if I am choosing both, he says after a moment, and Sophie tilts her head slightly, intrigued. Both, she echoes, and he nods. Something different. And you, the words are simple, but they carry a weight neither of them can pretend not to feel. Sophie looks at him, her expression shifting again, not pulling away, but not fully stepping forward either, caught somewhere in between. That sounds nice, she says quietly, but it also sounds like something that belongs in a story, not real life. Alexander almost smiles at that, but there is something serious beneath it. Maybe that is because people do not give it a chance to be real, he replies, and for a moment, neither of them speaks, the space between them filled with something fragile, something that could either grow or disappear depending on what happens next. And then Sophie reaches for her glass, taking a small sip as if buying herself time, her thoughts clearly moving faster than her words. If you stay, she says slowly, setting the glass back down, then you're not just skipping whatever is upstairs. Her eyes meet his again, steady now. You are changing something, even if it is small. Alexander nods once, understanding exactly what she means, that choices like this never exist in isolation. They always lead somewhere, I know, he says, and for the first time, there is no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a quiet decision forming beneath the surface, and Sophie watches him for a second longer before letting out a soft breath. Then I guess this is where it stops being an accident, she says, and there's no fear in her tone now, just awareness, and Alexander meets her gaze, something steady and certain settling into place. It already has, he replies, and somewhere deep down, both of them feel it, the shift from something slucher to something chosen, something real, even if neither of them knows what it will cost yet. The moment settles between them, no longer fragile but charged with something deeper, something that feels like it has already crossed a line neither of them can step back from. And Sophie leans back slightly in her chair, her arms folding loosely as she studies him with a new kind of clarity. Then answer me one thing, she says, her voice calm but deliberate. If this is real, why does it feel like you are still holding something back? The question lands gently, but it cuts straight through. Everything unspoken, and Alexander does not respond immediately because for the first time tonight, there is no easy way around the truth, no half answer that will keep this moment intact without changing it. His jaw tightens slightly, his gaze shifting for just a second before returning to her. And Sophie notices, of course she does, because she has been noticing everything about him since the moment she sat down. It is not just about you avoiding expectations, she continues softly. It is about you deciding how much of yourself you're willing to show. Alexander exhales slowly, the weight of her words settling in, because she is right, more right than anyone has been in a long time. And that realization does not feel threatening. It feels inevitable. You are not wrong, he admits quietly, his voice lower now, stripped of any pretense. And Sophie nods once, not pushing, just waiting, giving him the space to decide what comes next. And that is what makes it harder, not easier, because she is not demanding the truth, she is allowing it. And that kind of openness is something he does not know how to meet without consequence. The man who came to this table, he says slowly, choosing each word carefully, is not the same person people expect upstairs. Sophie watches him closely, her expression unreadable but attentive. "And which one is real?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper now. And Alexander hesitates, not because he does not know, but because saying it out loud makes it permanent. "I am still figuring that out," he says finally, and there is honesty in that. Raw and unfinished. Sophie lets out a quiet breath, her gaze softening just slightly. "At least that is real," she says, and there's no judgment in her tone, just acceptance. But then her eyes drift toward the staircase again, where the last few guests have disappeared, the world he belongs to now fully out of sight, but still very much present. And when she looked back at him, something has changed, not distance, but awareness. "You cannot stay here forever," she says gently, and Alexander nods because he knows that. He has always known that, but knowing something does not make it easier to act on it. "No," he agrees, and for a second, neither of them speaks, the reality of the moment pressing in, not as an ending, but as a turning point. Sophie reaches for her glass again, her fingers steady now, her thoughts clearer. "Then whatever this is," she says slowly, "it does not get to exist in just one version of you." Her eyes meet his again, steady and certain. "Because I am not interested in something that only works when the truth is hidden." The words are not harsh, but they are firm, and they land exactly where they need to. Alexander feels it immediately, the shift from possibility to choice, from something easy to something real. And for the first time, he realizes that staying here is not enough. Not if he wants this to mean anything beyond tonight. You're asking me to step into your world," he says quietly. And Sophie shakes her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "No," she corrects him. "I am asking you to stop hiding from yours. The difference is small, but it changes everything." And Alexander sits there for a moment, the weight of that truth settling in, heavier than anything else tonight, because it is not about choosing between two places. It is about choosing who he is willing to be. And when he finally looks back at her, something in his expression has shifted, something more certain, more resolved, even if the cost is still unknown. "Then I guess I have a decision to make," he says, and Sophie nods once, her gaze steady. "You already did," she replies softly, and this time there is no doubt in her voice, because whatever happens next, the moment they crossed from accident to intention cannot be undone. Alexander stands slowly, the chair barely making a sound against the polished floor, but the movement feels louder than anything that has happened tonight. And for a brief second, Sophie wonders if this is where it ends, if this is the moment where reality steps back in and everything they built in the last hour simply fades into something that almost happened. But then he does not turn toward the staircase. He does not reach for his phone or adjust into the version of himself the world expects. Instead, he looks at her fully, openly, like there's nothing left to hide. "Come with me," he says quietly, and the words catch her off guard, her brows drawing together slightly as she processes what he means. "Upstairs," she asks, her voice uncertain, and he shakes his head, a faint, almost relieved smile touching his lips. "No," he says, "away from here." Sophie studies him carefully, searching for hesitation, for doubt, but she does not find it, only something steady, something real, and it makes her heart beat just a little faster. "You are just going to leave," she says, not as a question, but as a realization, and he nods once yes. He answers simple, final, and for the first time, it does not feel like he is walking away from something. It feels like he is walking toward something. Sophie glances toward the staircase one last time. The world that almost pulled him back now distant and irrelevant, then back at him, and there's a quiet understanding in her eyes now, something that was not there before. "That is a big choice for someone you just met," she says softly, and Alexander exhales. A small breath that feels like the release of something he has carried for far too long, maybe, he says, or maybe it is the first honest one I have made in a while. The words settle between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just true, and Sophie feels it, the weight of it, the sincerity behind it. And for a moment, she hesitates, not because she doubts him, but because she understands what this means, not just for him, but for her too, stepping into something unknown, something that does not come with guarantees. "If I go with you," she says slowly, her voice steady but careful, This does not stay a mistake. Alexander meets her gaze without hesitation. It already is not, he replies. And there is something in the way he says it that makes it impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend this is anything less than real. Sophie holds his gaze for a second longer, then lets out a soft breath, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming as she stands as well, her chair sliding back quietly. Then I guess we should stop pretending it ever was, she says, and for the first time since the night began, there is no confusion left in her voice, no uncertainty, just a choice, clear and intentional. Alexander nods, something steady settling in a place inside him. And without another word, they walk toward the exit together, not rushed, not hesitant, just two people stepping into something they did not plan, but are no longer willing to walk away from. The doors open, the cool night air meeting them like a quiet contrast to everything they are leaving behind. And as they step outside, the city stretches out in front of them, wide and uncertain and full of possibilities. Sophie glances at him, a small smile returning, softer this time, more grounded, so she says, "Where do we go now?" Alexander looks ahead, then back at her, and for once, the answer does not come from a plan or a schedule or an expectation. It comes from something simpler, something real, somewhere that feels like yours, he says, and Sophie's smile deepens just slightly at that, because for the first time in a long time, the idea does not feel impossible. And as they walk forward together, the mistake that brought them here fades into something else entirely. Not an accident, not a coincidence, but a beginning neither of them saw coming, and neither of them wants to end.